Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen.
I lost everything overnight. Lost my marriage, my family. Even though I didn't want to be with Jen anymore, I wanted my family. And I lost my career. And I lost another home, the home that we had made here. It was really hard. I mean, it made me realize how much identity I had around, being in Psychick TV and helping to run Temple Records. That had been my whole life since I was 18. That had been my whole life for like 11 years. And overnight, it was gone.
This is the second part of a conversation with Alaura O'Dell, formerly known as Paula P-Orridge. If you haven't already, I do recommend listening to the first part of that conversation, which is linked in the show notes. And in that, we traced Alaura's journey from being a schoolgirl in East London to her meeting with the provocative musician and cultural provocateur Genesis P-Orridge, to becoming a central actor in the underground art band Psychick TV and the occult network the Temple of Psychick Youth, or TOPY as it was known. The Psychick TV was a kind of multimedia art music project that blurred the boundaries between performance, ritual, experimentation in sound and imagery, imbued with a sense of magic with a K, i.e. in both the occult and transformative sense. And the Temple of Psychick Youth, TOPY, was a loosely structured global network of artists, occultists and seekers that emerged in the 1980s and became quite infamous. And whilst public accounts often focused on TOPY's founder Genesis P-Orridge, in the conversation with Lara, we heard about her role, not just as a participant, but as an organiser and practitioner, the one who handled the workings, the practical magic behind the grand metaphysical ideas and gestures. We heard about the police raids in Britain during that infamous satanic panic, accusations of moral deviance and implied child abuse in the press. Now we left Alaura, or as she was at the time, and Genesis in Kathmandu, and we take up the story as David Gentile, their lawyer, has advised them not to return to Britain, and then how they embark upon a life of exile in California, finding unexpected refuge with the family of Winona Ryder, entering a new West Coast countercultural milieu that included encounters with Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna, before hearing about Alaura's musical incarnation as Mistress Mix and life after Psychick TV, TOPY and Genesis. Here we go.
David Gentle, our lawyer, said there's no charges against you, so you can come back. However, if I was you, I wouldn't come back because they're going to harass you. Social workers can come in and just take your children because of these claims, etc., etc. And we didn't want to risk it. And I was just looking through an old diary, and I have a photo, a selfie I took actually before we had cell phones, but it was one of these little miniature Polaroid cameras that would print out. And it's a photo of me after I phoned Scotland Yard. So I phoned Scotland Yard and I got through to the main switchboard. My house was raided, all my stuff, all archive was taken. There was no charges. Who do I talk to? You got to go through to, our basement storage department. So I got hold of this guy, explained the situation. And he goes, oh no, I ain't got that anymore. I mean, after that time, no, it's all destroyed. It's all gone. And I could have followed up more, but there's this photo of me and I'm completely in shock because there were videos and photos of the children's childhood, their birthday parties. They obviously didn't take everything because we did end up with some of our archive, like our master tapes. And there were some things that were definitely left that was shipped over to us. So I could almost laugh about it now, trying to make life of it, but it was so traumatic. It was devastating. Even with myself being raised from a super young age, never to trust the police, it was still absolutely shocking. Like this day and age, they would orchestrate a complete untruth and have that much power.
Yeah.
To try and destroy us.
That's what it's about, isn't it? Yeah. So having received that news from David Gentile, you make then the decision basically to become exiles. You flee. I mean, there's no other way to describe it really, to the West Coast because you have this opportunity to stay with what you thought were just some fans, right?
Yeah. We met Michael backstage at our Dingwall gig in Camden, and it happened to be one of those great gigs, where the audience is just so alive, the band's so alive, like everyone is like ecstatic. I'm sure a lot of people were on ecstasy. The truth be known, but it was just an amazing night. And Michael came back. He was middle-aged, and he was like, "Oh my God, this is one of the best gigs I've ever been to." And then we met him and his wife once when we came to San Francisco touring. And when we were in Kathmandu, we got the news. I looked through my file of facts, found a postcard from them that said, "If you ever need a refuge, call us." And I think they meant if we were on tour, we needed a day off. So we rang them we'd gone back to Bangkok at this point, and we were like, "We need a refuge." So long story short, we ended up in their house in Petaluma, which is like 35 miles north at the Golden Gate Bridge. And we lived with them for about a month. And when I was in their house, but there's all these Hollywood posters of movies with one actress. And I was like, wow, they're really, really into this actress. Kind of odd. And then one day I came home and I saw, and the actress was sitting in the living room in an armchair, and she turns around, and it was Winona Ryder. They were the parents of Winona Ryder, but they were very good friends with Tim Leary, and they would speak to Tim regularly. On one of those evenings, Jen got on the phone, and Tim invited us to go and visit him. And then that was this other fantastic, interesting period. And also looking back, even though it was incredibly traumatic, all of it, when people say, "Oh, everything happens for a reason," because bad things can happen, that you're just like, why? But it really was like a huge door shutting in our face. And actually, with all the Thatcher years and all that oppression, I was saying to Jen, I think I want to move somewhere else.
Right.
And in California. So it got us to California.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that sort of destiny takes a hand sometimes. You see these things in retrospect. I call them sort of signposts along the road, which you don't necessarily recognize at the time. But looking back, you think, actually, that was kind of destiny stepping in somehow, in terms of what happens next to get to the West Coast. And then to meet these people, who are obviously lovely people, but also connected with that other kind of counterculture, because we're talking 92 here. I mean, Leary had been at it for going almost 30 years, right? So he was a countercultural legend. And how did you find him? How did you find him personally?
I loved him, and I, in some ways, I regret sort of not sitting down and like, tell me about your life. But it wasn't like that with Tim. It was sort of his house. I say this to people here and they don't know what I mean, but it was like Battersea Dogs Hunt. It's like people coming in and out, all day long, leaving. You never know who was going to show up, like the Wastes and Strays. And for me, Tim was like, I knew his name. To be honest, I didn't know all this amazing stuff. Like I knew he'd been connected to acid, LSD, but, I didn't know that he'd been in prison and that he escaped with the help of the weather people. I mean, wow. What a life. But to me, it was like he was this older gentleman who was like, my home is your home, and he was great with the children, my kids. And his son was there, Zach Leary, who he'd adopted when he married, I think it was his last wife, Barbara Leary. And it was just like, he was a friend. He was really a friend who I wouldn't say, I got super close to or really knew him. But I knew this man who was incredibly hospitable. For example, when I left Jen, he got it. But he said, whatever you need, I can't give you money, but you and the girls, if you need somewhere to live, you can come and live here. And that was so incredibly generous that I met so many people there. Like Tim woke me up in the middle of the night. I would sleep in his office. I had a pull-out sofa bed. And he woke me up and he's like, Alaura, Beastie Boys are here. And I was like, what time is it? And he's like, I don't know, it's like four or something. He's shuffling in his desk looking for something. And later I'm like, was I looking for acid? And I was like, no, I'm too tired. And he's like, well, did the girls want to meet the Beastie Boys? Like my children. I was like, I don't know. You could go and ask them. But yeah, it was just, and when people showed up, it was like, they're just ordinary people, but they might be super famous.
Did you guys do acid together?
I didn't. I'll tell you a story. We were going off to see Toy Story 1. I'm not into animated films in general. And Zach, Tim's son, was like, okay, so we're going to all go. And I think Sean Lennon was there and all these other people. We're going to go off in these cars. But so you bring Tim, you can drive the Jeep or Tim's car. And you bring Tim and the girls. I think Jen already went. And I was like, okay. And then I'm looking at the clock and I'm going, Tim, we better go. And he's like, oh, I just got to do one more thing. And he's got a cigarette hanging out his mouth. And then I hear this bell go off. And I thought it was the bell on the oven stove or the toaster oven. And then Caress runs in and she goes, Mom, there's a fire in Tim's office. And I think he'd thrown his cigarette into the waste paper basket. And at the time, all his archives are there. And he's got his archivist going through all the stuff. So I like run in and there's flames, and I'm looking around like, what? And then Tim sees it and just comes in. Opens the back door to his office, takes the waste paper basket out, gets the hose, and he goes, Laura, we're going to be late for the movie. And I'm like, oh no. So anyway, we get there. We've got this whole row of seats. And Toy Story starts. And everyone's going, oh. And it took me a while. And everyone's tripping, apart from me and the children. And I'm like, I get it. I'm the designated driver. So I actually didn't take acid at that house. I probably took some MDMA at some point. But we did this huge rave when we were there. Eva's erotic banquet. I think it was it was a huge warehouse. It might have been 6 floors. And Tim came and he was talking over the music. We had incredible visuals. And then I believe it was the day after, the Rodney King riot started. That it was wild to be in LA, and Tim's house was up in Beverly Hills. Looking out, it looked like a war zone. You just saw these fires, individual fires going on, and it was a crazy time. But
also the time for you guys musically, when you start to reinvent yourselves from what you've been doing over here to connect into that rave MDMA culture, right, as well.
Yeah. I mean, we'd started a bit before we left, and we'd connected with Wax Trax Records in Chicago. So we were already a bit into the rave scene. And I think we'd already recorded Techno Acid B and Ultra House. But yeah, it was like, we could do these huge raves here, like this Shiva's Erotic Banquet. And then we did this other rave, and it was called, in San Francisco, Don't Drink the Water. And it was at Caesar's Palace, which had been this Latino club and big club. And literally people had liquid acid in water bottles. People came up to me and were like, do you need water? And I was like, is it the water? Because it was spelled don't drink the E water. But there was a lot of people high. And yeah. So, it was a blast, really. I mean, getting over the shock, it was a blast being in San Francisco in LA in the early 90s.
Right. And then you guys get yourself sorted, don't you? So you've been staying with people, but then you get your own place. And it looks, from what I've seen, pretty idyllic as well.
Yeah. I mean, actually, it was a miracle we got a place because we had no credit history. And here, you have to have credit history, but we taught this rental agency, we're a nice family. Jen might look a bit odd. Jen bought me a t-shirt in this town and it said, my next husband will be normal. We both looked a bit hippie-ish, but got this little house in Monterey and it looks idyllic. And I later found out that the street we were on was notorious for meth labs in the middle of the countryside. It's no. And then we we were probably only there 6 months, and the owner wanted to move in, but the same management company found us a house further out, and it was idyllic. It was idyllic for the kids. I met Terence McKenna at Tim and Mike and Cindy's house. Honestly, I remember one of the first things that Terence McKenna said to me was, "Do you want to try any 2CB?" And I was like, no, thank you. But thanks for. They said that he lived where we were living. Him and his wife, Kathleen, really liked the schools that the kids went to. Like, the public free schools, state schools. So we got the kids in harmony. And Terence's kids went there, and actually his daughter became good friends. Tom Waits' kids also went there. And Cress is good friends with their daughter, Kelly Simone. I ran into Tom and his wife the other day. And Tom always does the same thing. I'll be like, "Hi, Tom." And he always looks like, "Oh no, another fan." And I'm like, "It's Caress's mom. It's okay." They're lovely. But a lot of people have gravitated to where I live, that we just ended up here by chance, because it's bucolic, it's beautiful, and it's got a strong alternative scene. Yeah. The Grateful Dead live up here as well.
So tell us about your life and how you managed TOPY from there, and what was changing and what were you up to for the next couple of years?
Well, that was really hard, like managing everything. We hadn't been here that long. I think about 8 months, maybe a little bit longer. But for me, the marriage was completely over, and it had been over a long time before for me. And I left Jen.
We're going to have to talk about this. Let's just back up. So obviously, I know that your split was very painful and very difficult, particularly for you.
Yeah.
But let's talk us through it. What had happened? What had changed? What were the issues for you that brought it to the point where you're like, "I'm out"?
Yeah, it's hard to talk about it, and I'm always really careful because I don't want to upset my children. And one of the ways to sum it up is, I was around 15 when I met Jen. We weren't in a relationship till I was 18. And I wasn't completely naive, but I was pretty naive in terms of relationship. And Jen was extremely charismatic and very smart, very interesting. The honeymoon period was amazing. Like being with him, meeting interesting people. We'd drop in on Derek Jarman regularly. Like Jen was really into going up to Soho in the West End, seeing Alex Ferguson and Peter Christopherson, who founded Psychick TV with him. And then I later joined, and things really started to unravel. It was not in the vocabulary, I believe, then to talk about narcissism on the scale that we have. I felt a lot of control from Jen, manipulation, and Cozy wrote about that, mentions that in her first memoir. And I know that when Jen was asked about it, he responded, "Oh, she knows what sells books," So I really wanted to keep the family together. And then when we moved to the States, when I broached the subject of, I can't do this anymore, and I need to separate and leave, it was, no, I'll change, and it was very much, what do they call that? Hearts and roses. Like someone has an explosive temper and then begs forgiveness and makes promises. So after moving here and losing everything, I think it was just the icing on top of the cake for me. And I was then 29, and I was like, I have to change my life.
You must have grown quite a lot during that time, from being a 15, 18-year-old. That's well over a decade, isn't it? You just felt encaged in some way.
Yeah, the full gamut, without getting into all the details. Absolutely the full gamut. And I should add, which is an important part, that, by this point, I was not in love anymore. At Tim's house, I met Andrew Frith, who was part of this team called Hyperdelic. And they were doing these incredible visuals and working with Tim. They'd met him in Tokyo. And Andrew, going by Andy then, had been working with Tim in Tokyo, where Andy had been living for 10 years. And we got into this conversation that just went on and on and on and on, and we fell in love. Yeah. So that was another layer of what do I want my life to be?
And you've got a family as well. You've got 2 kids together. How do you get out from underneath that? You're ready. Obviously, you're ready to leave for all the reasons we just discussed, plus you've fallen in love with somebody else. But how do you get out from under a situation where it's both very controlling and also I imagine you've got this sense of this is going to break our family up?
Let's just say I literally had to run for my life. I left with the clothes on my back. When I told Jen, this is it, we'd done a bit of back and forth, and I kept waiting for the right moment. There isn't a right moment. And I just said to Jen, I'm leaving.
Where did you run to and what happened with the kids?
So I think the girls were at school that day. We were absolutely in the middle of nowhere. And I ran to the general store and there was a phone booth. I rang Andy, and he ended up calling the women's shelter. I was also really in shock how I got into town. I think I probably walked a ways, and then maybe my friend Francine picked me up, and the kids were in school. I think it was Jen's turn to pick them up, but a friend who I met through Mike and Cindy had offered me the basement apartment in her house, rent-free for a couple of months. So I moved in there. And Jen was picking up the kids from school that day, but the narrative from Jen to the children and his narrative to everyone else that I had abandoned him and the children and left him and the children. I didn't want to be with the children anymore.
Still trying to control the situation then?
Yeah, very, very, very much. So he was the first one who actually filed for divorce. I didn't have the money. I was penniless when I left. And then he filed the divorce and he filed for sole custody of the children. And over here, you have to prove that you're a good parent. And the courts will only give you sole custody if the other parent is extremely abusive or, a drug addict or something like that. So when you file for sole custody, you have to get a psychological evaluation. Jen thought it was just going to be me, but it's both parents. It was 4 or 5 years going through the divorce process. And in that time, we had a custody worked out, having the children week to week. And we finally got joint custody. And then Jen moved to New York overnight without telling me. And then the custody reverted to me as sole physical custody. But that was hell. And I knew it would be, because Jen would threaten me, if you ever leave me, you'll never get the children and all that kind of stuff.
Did you manage to stay in contact through those 4 or 5 years, or was it just complete cut off?
With Jen, it was all through lawyers. And then we would see each other trading the children. And it was hell. It was absolute. So actually, it was kind of a relief when he did move to New York overnight when he got married.
How was it for the kids?
It was really hard on the children, and any separation or divorce, even if it's amicable, is hard on the children. But an acrimonious one was very traumatic for them.
Did you get together with Andy at this point?
It took us a couple of years at least to live together. But I had my own place where the children would come, had their own bedroom every other week. And I was able to keep them in the same school that they were in. And I had to keep things as normal as possible. And, they love their dad. I mean, my parents would physically fight with one another. I still love my dad. I still love my mom. My mom would only say bad things about my dad, but I always loved my dad.
What came over in that film about Genesis that David Rodriguez made recently? The most beautiful and most surprising things about it, we've talked about it already, you and I here, is that you were a very strong family. Maybe that's not what people expect of the figure that appeared in public.
It's not easy talking about that time. Yeah, I don't know how I survived, but I did.
You not just survived, you thrived.
I thrived. And a good friend the other day was asking me something about Jen, and I just went, oh, bless his cotton socks. And then I was like, you can't be scared of anyone anymore. And we came together for a reason. We did creative things. The best two are our amazing children. Yeah.
How did you make a living? Because I think the other thing which we should talk about is that subsequent to this, Jen basically cuts you out of everything, cuts you out of Psychick TV, and he actually kind of re-edited the history in some way, didn't he? By removing your name from credits on albums and all sorts of stuff, right?
Yeah. So I was completely cut out, not receiving royalties or child support. Finally got child support after a long time. I was getting $900 a month eventually. My visa was to do music, so I wasn't legally allowed to do anything else. So I was just finding any odd job that I could find under the table. And I had done all those kinds of jobs in London. I got my first job when I was 10 or 11, working down Ridley Market with a neighbor, selling net curtains. I think I was measuring them out for people. And then the sweet shop, I would sweep and mop a Greasy Spoon cafe after it closed. Wasn't being snobby. I would just take anything. So I was living on $5 a day. That was my budget, food and gas, after I paid the rent. And I think Andy helped me a couple of times with the rent. And then I think it was 96. So then my music visa was running out. Jen had become really good friends with the woman who did our visas and told her not to renew mine. So I didn't know what I was going to do. But then Kim Casconi at Silent Records was like, oh, I think if you record an album for us, we can get you that visa. So that's what I did. And I probably got a small advance. And I recorded Sacred Dreams with this guy that I met who had a whole little studio set up in his bedroom. It was released as a solo album, even though Justin gets credited on that album.
Inspired by wisdom, you're always there. Over hills and sway, among the ruins of love, you stand there.
Oh, and then I got a job at Silent Records. They were great. On the week that I didn't have the kids, I'd go into San Francisco. Andy was living there, stay with him. And I worked in this shipping department. So packaging back to what I was doing with TOPY and Psychick TV, packaging these boxes.
How did it feel being cut out of all that? Your relationship, you've lost your relationship, but also you lost your band. You lost your kind of, you lost your career in some ways, right?
I lost everything overnight. I lost my marriage, my family. Even though I didn't want to be with Jen anymore, I wanted my family. And I lost my career, and I lost another home, the home that we had made here. It was really hard. I mean, it made me realize how much identity I had around, being in Psychick TV and, helping to run Temple Records. That had been my whole life since I was 18. At 18, then was winding up Industrial Records and Throbbing Gristle, but very shortly after started Psychick TV and then Temple Records. That had been my whole life for like 11 years. And overnight, it was gone. Actually, I was on my knees. I was like, oh my friggin' God, like, what am I going to do? And so I really had to think about reinvention. In that time, Jen and I separated. I think it took me 4 years to go back to England. Neither of us went back for a few years. I mean, Jen would say, I'm a refugee, I'm in exile. When I was back in England, maybe after that 4 years or so, I went to see a high school friend who was now living in Leicester. And I remember her saying to me, "What are you going to do now?" And I was like, "I have no friggin' idea." I had always wanted to get my bachelor's degree. And when we moved to Brighton, I said to Jen, "Oh, I can start an English degree or sociology degree at Sussex." And he said, "No, you can't. You got to look after the kids and running the record company." And I said, "I'll still do that. Be at school when the kids are at school." And no, it was an absolute no. So I didn't have a degree. I was like, what are my skills? So anyway, this friend said to me, "What's your passion?" And I remember going, "Well, I like sleeping and no one's going to pay me for sleeping. I really like great sex, but I don't want to be paid for sex. And my big passion is sacred sites and Neolithic sites and stone circles." And she went, "Bring people over here, get grouped." And I was like, "Do you think people will be as passionate about like a bunch of old stones as me?" And she went, "Oh yeah, Americans will." And so I started a company called Sacred Journeys for Women, running events for TOPY and Psychick TV. I knew how to run events. I'd been doing my own research on, mythology and paganism and Neolithic sites, looking at, goddess mythology, like reading Marie Gimbutas and language of the goddess, civilization of the goddess, looking at the earliest civilization that we know with Hayak in Turkey, matrifocal culture, taking all of that, starting Sacred Journeys for Women, and from 96 to 2006, I took women on pilgrimages to Britain, England, Ireland, Scotland, up to Orkney, to Brodgar, and that was my reinvention.
Well, this is something you and I have got in common, isn't it? Because I'm a huge prehistoric circle head myself, and I think that I was at Callanish a few months ago for the Standstill, the 18.6 year event, where the moon's at its lowest, and I'm never happier than if I'm exploring, trying to find some obscure circle, and there is something deeply profound about that. For me, still, you put 10 years into making these pilgrimages, really, if people haven't been before. Let's say Sacred Journeys is a great way to describe it, isn't it? So a very different kind of life, but also very healing, I'm imagining, as well, compared with the 10 years that had gone previously.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was really healing. It was, discovering, who I was. And at that point, even though I'd had great experiences, amazing people in the music industry, created a body of work, I don't like the music business, but music is me. It's like not liking the business side of it, but liking the creativity. But I really put that behind me. And it was like, even when Jen and I were together, as soon as I had discovered a sacred site like on Bodmin Moor or on Dartmoor, I would just kick off my shoes and be on the earth. And we had TOPY campouts at Arbor Low, up in Derbyshire. We got to be in Stonehenge for a whole night. I felt so deeply connected to the land and so deeply connected to my ancestors of like, I'm from this land. This is magic, and there's so much that we don't know about these sites. And we can read as many books as we can get our hands on. But at the end of the day, I can just put my back on a standing stone or sit there with my back and feel this incredible energy. How did they know thousands of years ago to align those stones at Callanish for that 18.6 lunar cycle?
It is truly mind-bending, actually. One can only kind of reach out to it imaginatively and sort of try and get some connection with the prehistoric imagination, where the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the years, the cycle of the planets mixed, with the annual season of breeding and harvesting, and all those things are kind of completely enmeshed within your ordinary life, but also in your sacred life. That's the way I see it. There's no distinction in a sense between what was the mundane and the sacred, because you're also dependent on nature to survive in a way that we're not anymore. So these cycles and patterns and the rhythm of the universe and the stars becomes completely part of your community, and it affects the way that you bury your ancestors and what you do with the ancestors remains, that they're still with you. They're not sort of thrust away or burnt and forgotten about as we do, but they become part of like an ongoing living tradition, and some people even suggested that the stones in the stone circle themselves represent the ancestors, that they're actually around you as you're meeting, as you're feasting, as you're partying, as you're mating, that they're there with you all the time. It's a very completely different culture from ours, but we can still get a sense of it by going to these places, and particularly maybe the ones that are, further out and less visited, less tamed by English Heritage and National Trust.
I agree, 100%. It's like if you go to Glastonbury, an amazing place. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of visitors go, and it's one of the more famous sites like Stonehenge. But even English Heritage have put up a sign that says this has been a place of pilgrimages for over 10,000 years. So even a government kind of agency is saying that. But when you discover and then all those sites that are off the beaten track and that they're not so visited by tourists, but more local people who are, tying their prayers to the tree and around the well, I feel that I can get a deeper sense of connection. Like I love Stonehenge, but I'd be happy, at Mellon-Toll or, the Nine Ladies or Boscanoon or somewhere, the Hurlers.
Yeah.
Hurlers is one of my favorite.
The Hurlers is the Hurlers, the Plague Market, this is the Arbor Low and Stanton Drew,
Yeah.
the Rollright Stones, all these wonderful places. 10 years of that. And then sort of bring us up to date from 2006 for the last 20 years or so. What have you been up to? Where are you living? Who are you living with? What's going on?
Yeah. Well, I closed Sacred Genesse Women because 9/11 happened and everyone that year cancelled their tour. No one wanted to travel on a plane. I kept it going, for 6 more years, and it never got to the momentum of it as it was before. And I knew that I was ready for something else. I wanted to fulfill this lifelong dream of getting my bachelor's. So to get a bachelor's, you have to get a master's, you have to do math over here. And I was like, oh my God, I can't do math. But I went to the local community college, got all my prerequisites apart from math. My college was pretty progressive, the California Institute of Integral Studies. They had a class for people like me. It was like for people with math anxiety. So I got my math, got my bachelor's in a year, went straight into an MFA program and concentrated on creative writing. So it's creative writing and consciousness. But you have to write an application letter. And I was like, oh God, what do I say? And someone said, you should put in there that you were in Psychick TV. And I was like, oh, they wouldn't have heard of Psychick TV. Anyway, my writing professor, totally knew about Psychick TV. And then it was brought up in one of the classes one day. Not me. I never say that I was in this band. And one of the students literally nearly fell off his chair. He was like, oh my God, you're Alaura from Psychick TV. It was so funny. But it was a great college for me to go to because my friend said you would seem absolutely normal at that school because everyone's so quirky. So, all in all, that took me about 10 years to go back to school and, and do my master's and my bachelor's. And it was a lot of work and it was amazing to do that. And then I was married to Andy. He was like one of the first web designers, etc. So he basically was like taking on the financial responsibility when I started off in school. So I focused on that and then graduated. And it was again like, what am I going to do? And then it was like, well, I'd love to hold a sacred space, which I'd been doing for women on these tours and workshops of how can I hold a safe space for women to drop into their voice and share their stories? Oh, now I'll take it into workshops. So I was teaching workshops and I teach a regular weekly class. And if anyone asks me that doesn't know me, they say, what do you do? And I go, I teach creative writing. But what I really do is hold a safe space for people to find their authentic voice. So I've been doing that for several years. And then a couple of years ago, I was invited down to a little evening of veil from Research magazine. He was invited to talk about research in a little bookstore. And this guy organized it and contacted me and said, I really feel like you need to be there. You're such a big part of that. And you're in so many of the magazines. So long story short, I went down, connected with this woman. And out of the blue, a couple of weeks ago, she contacted me and she's like, we're putting on this event, been a collective electronic ambient music. I suppose they've been going on for 25 years. And she's like, are you interested in performing? And I haven't performed for decades. And I was like, sure. Like, why not? And she's like, well, you can just come and read. You can do anything you want. But I have been recording on and off with someone I've known for 30 years. And it was majorly put on hold with the pandemic. And then she's like, what name do you want to go under? And I was just like, well, Alaura O'Dell. Then I ran it by Jason, who I record with, and a really good friend. And I was like, what do you think? And they were like, you got to use Mistress Mix because that was your name when you were creating all the sound collaging and you were DJing. Because I DJ'd with the flight case built with 6 cassette tapes and 6 cassette decks. And then I had about 300 tapes that I would just mix on, just spontaneously. And a 6-channel mixer and a DI box. And then my friend's like, do you have those tapes? And I was like, no. And he's like, why not? And I said, no, Jen demanded them back. And they were like, but they were yours. And I said, yeah, Jen was like, they're my property. And I was just like, whatever, just take them. Like I said, I left with the clothes on my back. So yeah. And then I was talking to a good friend the other day who I met here just a few years ago. I overheard his English accent. So we start talking and he does music. And then I was like, oh, I used to be in a band. And he told me later that when people say that, he rolls his eyes internally and he's thinking, so it came up in conversations like Git TV. And he was like, oh my God, you was like Git TV. So he's English and his band is The Bees. They're amazing. But I talked to him the other day and he's got a really high quality tape deck. So I'm going to start working with Jason, putting something together. And I'm actually, don't know if you can tell, I'm actually super excited.
Mistress Mix is back.
Mistress Mix is back.
I am your love. The one you love. I'll hate you much. I'll touch your skin. I'll feel your pain. Look at me. Look at me. I'll take your heart. You see my dreams.
Some spirals there, right? Spiraling right round to music and performance, including all the stuff that's on the way. When did you decide to stop being Paula and become Alaura?
Oh, it was nearly close to 40 years ago. We were on tour in the States and we met this woman who worked, in magic, the shaman. Her name was Nema, Nema. And I think Jen introduced me and said, this is Paula, but she heard Alaura. And she was like, Alaura. And I was like, oh no, my name's Paula. I was like, but I like that name. And it stuck. And Jen started calling me Alaura. And it stuck. And legally, I'm Alaura.
Right.
Changed my name, my American passport, my ID, everything. And then O'Dell is my mother's maiden name. So claiming that part of the family, my grandfather was from Dungarvan in County Waterford. So I have Irish on both sides of my family. Lots and lots of Irish cousins. Yeah. But it almost fitted sort of coming to the States with a new name.
And
yeah.
Alaura, What about you and Jen down the years since, over those last, what is it now, 30 years? Did you stay in contact? Did you not? When did you last see him? What's been your sort of history in the last few decades?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I remember when I was doing my master's, my printer had an issue. So I called Caress, who was just pretty much living over the road. And I said, hey, can I use your printer? And she was like, yay. And she went, oh, but Dad's here. And I was like, that's okay. I'm fine with your dad. And then she went, oh, it's fine. He sleeps till 1 o'clock. So anyway, I went over and he was up, awake and dressed. And I walked in and I hadn't seen him for a while. I don't think we'd really been in contact. Oh, the last time I saw him before that was Caress's wedding in Turkey. So I just walked in the door and I went, hey, Jen. And I gave him a big hug. And I just was like, later, I've just forgiven him. Like, you got to forgive. They say you forgive not for the other person, but for yourself. I think he was a bit shocked. I was like, hey, and we talked. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm writing this paper and I'm using the word circuitous. And he's like, yes, circuitous. He's super smart, going around in circles, So we have this great conversation and we stayed in contact. I mean, I would call him. Andy and I ended up separating. We're still friends. He's a lovely, lovely man. He moved back to Australia and I was dating an English guy, actually, that I met in England years ago. He's a musician, Stephen Kent, plays didgeridoo and other things. And he's like 40 miles from me. And when I was driving to see him, I would call Jen. And I'd be like, hey, how are you? Basically, Jen talked for 40 minutes until I got there. I don't think he rarely said, how are you? But, at that point, his health was declining. And I've got a bunch of texts on my phone that I still have that we would text. And then he'd send me photos. And there was one photo like, this is my blood bag. And I was like, I'm not sure why he sent me that.
How did you feel when you heard he died?
So I swear to God, the divine, when I left Jen, I did not listen to Psychick TV. I was just like, I have to start again. And Caress called me and told me. And for that, the whole weekend, I just played Psychick TV and those songs that Jen wrote for me, like Stolen Kisses and Just Drifting. And I cried and listened to this music. And then after that, the day repeatedly. And even my girls rang me, for his funeral and was like, what do you think? What should we put on the altar? And they ended up putting a family photo of the four of us. I had this strong feeling that Jen wouldn't live beyond 70. And he had been in ill health. And I think he probably started to go really downhill when his wife died suddenly. In a way, I was almost surprised how upset I was, but then we'd had those years together and we had children together.
What had you made of his transformations, the surgical modifications, and what did you think of that?
I don't think I put a lot of thought into it because people would ask me, like we'd be divorced for 30 years and people would go, how's Jen? I'm like, I don't know. What's Jen doing? I'm like, because people wouldn't ask you what your ex is doing completely.
For sure. But it's like, what's Jen doing? He's just got a pair of breasts.
Exactly. It's like what a friend in London, she knew all these people. She said to me, oh, yeah, Jen and his wife came and was, as they were leaving, they hugged me and their boobs were so hard. I just thought it was an art project, really. I think that, and I really didn't put too much thought into it. Jen being Jen and pushing the envelope and, he would reinvent himself. Yeah.
Alaura, in a sense, you've kept quiet about it for 30 odd years. You've had a very busy, full-on life post-Psychick TV, post-Genesis. But you've decided recently, haven't you, that you're going to write about it, that you're going to talk about it and, I guess reconnect with it and sort of re-own it in some way. What brought you to that?
Well, when I was doing my master's and I was working on this memoir in my master's program on my childhood, I think it was my professor and his wife, who was also a professor there, knew about Psychick TV. And they were like, no, you need to write about when you're in the music business. And then other people said that to me. And then, memoirs are usually a slice of your life, like maybe a 10-year period. I think I hadn't written about it because it was too painful, but it did get to the place of like, I need to just reclaim, reclaim me. And maybe there is that part of like, I think so completely written out that it's my narrative and my voice and my memories and stories, and there was a lot of great things that happened, a lot of fun things, and a lot of interesting things. And I think counterculture, I don't think we were seeing it that way at the time, but yeah, what we were doing was very much counterculture at the time. So it's time to reclaim it. And yeah. So that's what I'm up to these days, doing that, teaching. And I've just decided I think I want to do sacred site tours again, but focus on creativity, like stay somewhere like the Chalice Well Gardens, have the workshop room, write, be creative every day and be surrounded by these sacred sites. I'd love to spend a bit more time in Britain being at the sacred sites. Yeah, it's been too long.
Alaura O'Dell, thank you very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks to Alaura. Links to her work and more about her in the show notes. She's a beautiful person, as I'm sure you picked up, and has so many great stories to tell. I'm looking forward to her memoir. I'm very pleased that she's performing as Mistress Mix again. Obviously, Genesis P-Orridge casts a very long shadow, but I hope this conversation and the previous one helps foreground her contribution as a musician, artist and occult practitioner. Like many women in the counterculture, her contribution has been rather sidelined or relegated to being the muse, which sounds romantic but actually is a bit demeaning. As I mentioned here and in the previous conversation, footage of Alaura and Genesis and their kids in David Rodriguez's film She, He Is Still Here is very striking and rather poignant given what happened. It's obvious throughout that film how important his birth family and this one was to Genesis, and quite a contrast, I think, with the public persona or image of a wrecker of civilization as the press painted him. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for listening. Thanks to my recent correspondents Michael, David, Eleanor, Pat and Pee-wee. You can join them, drop us a line via bureauoflostculture.com. It's always great to hear from people. With your thoughts on the show, that's rather sustaining, I have to say. And I'm planning to meet you further down the road, around the bend, and over the hillsides for more of these conversations, these stories and tales from the other side.